One of the highlights that I could never have imagined as Chief Justice of California would be to sit across from you and have the opportunity to ask you questions. And there's so much that could be covered in your iconic professional career. But I want to give everyone a reminder of how you came here today and to lead us into the questioning. I want to say that it started with your family, with walnut trees that you and your brother planted. And from there, who knew that it would be law school by trade, and then to the House of Congress, thereafter to become a wonk on the budget, to become the director, I believe, of the House budget, thereafter to be tapped as the director of the Office of Management and Budget, thereafter to be tapped as Chief of Staff to the Clinton administration, thereafter, I believe, to become the director of the CIA, thereafter to become the Secretary of Defense. Any one of those positions would be a career lifetime achievement, and yet you've had 5 of them, and then are back with the walnut trees. I've heard it said about you that you have had the toughest jobs in Washington. You've balanced the budget. You found Osama bin Laden after a decade of silence. You helped depose Gaddafi. You have helped prevent Iran from finding and preparing a nuclear weapon. You have been privy to conversations. You've stood up for your principles. And so today we are truly honored to have you for 30 minutes to ask you about how is it possible? How is this possible? And to be grateful to have you here. So I'm going to start off with a question that gives you an opportunity for wide-ranging response. And again, with this backdrop, having the toughest jobs, what led you with all of this skill and talent to a profession in the public sector?
Well, first of all, thank you. It's great to be with the Chief Justice, and it's great to be with all of you, a lot of friends that are part of this audience. And I want to commend you for establishing the foundation for democracy and justice. And I think it's so essential these days to try to educate the public, and particularly our kids, on the nature of our democracy, on 3 separate but equal branches of government, and particularly to focus on the judiciary, because I think, unfortunately, there are a lot of young people, for that matter, there are legislators, who don't quite understand what the Supreme Court is all about, and what role our judiciary has to play when it comes to the 3 separate branches of government. So I want to commend you, commend Frank Damerel for his work. Les Francis, I know, is doing some stuff on a campaign to educate. Alan, all of the chamber, all of you, my thanks to you, because the biggest challenge that the next president is going to face is the challenge of being able to break the dysfunction in Washington and to try to govern. And I really think that unless we get back to governing, and unless we get back to dealing with the challenges facing this country, that the worst thing that could happen to our country is 4 more years of paralysis. So it has to begin with all of us, and this is a good place to start. So my thanks to you, and my thanks for inviting me to be here. I think it really started as student body president in high school, if you want to know the truth. I mean, I suddenly, when I went to high school, got very interested in kind of student politics, and I ran for vice president and won, and then ran for president and won, and enjoyed the job. And then, of course, went on to Santa Clara University, where I took political science as my major, and obviously that continued to inspire me to get involved in public service. Did some things in the student body there. Then law school, and enjoyed going going to law school and also participating in activities in law school as well. And then I went into the Army for 2 years after I got out of, because I was in ROTC, went through ROTC, had a deferment through law school. When I was getting out of the Army, it was the question of whether I would go into the practice of law with my brother or whether I would try to do something more. And I was really interested in Washington. I spent some time in Washington in the military. And so, but I didn't have any context. So look, I'm the son of Italian immigrants. I didn't know people at the highest levels at all, much less in politics here in California. But I decided, I was a first lieutenant, and I decided to write a guy who was an assistant to Lyndon Johnson by the name of Joe Califano. And the reason I wrote Califano is because I didn't know him, but his last name was Califano. And so I wrote him and I said, look, you're Italian, I'm Italian, I really think, it's great to have somebody who's an assistant to the president. I really admire you. And I'll be damned if he didn't call me. I was at G2 at Fort Ord in those days. And he called me at G2. And he actually set up several appointments in Washington. And I flew back to Washington in uniform because you could fly at half price in those days if you wore your uniform. So I went back to Washington. I had interviews at Justice, interviews at at the Pentagon, at Defense, and about 3 others. And then I went up to Capitol Hill, and I loved politics up there, and I just decided to walk up to Capitol Hill. I walked into Kuechel's office, Tom Kuechel, who was the senator from California at the time. And I liked Kuechel, I liked his politics. And I walked in and just said, I'm just kind of walking around and wondering if there's any opportunity here. And sure enough, they were looking for a legislative assistant. And because I was in the Army, because I was a lawyer, they were willing to, to offer me a position. And, at the time I went back to Washington as a legislative assistant to Tom Kuechel, I thought I'd be staying for 2 years. And 50 years later, I'm still bouncing around. But that was really the path that I kind of followed to get into public life.
So it sounds like you knew that you wanted to affect policy. You wanted to be at the seat of change, and you went directly to DC. So when you were in DC and you are a law school graduate and you have military experience, what surprised you about being in DC at the hub of government?
Well, I've had a lot of surprises in all the positions I've held.
We're going to get to those later.
But I think the most interesting thing about going back to Washington from California and then, suddenly being a legislative assistant to a U.S. senator and walking on the floor of the Senate is that you realize that it's people. These are people. I've watched these people on television. You watch, I mean, in those days, it was people like Fulbright, Symington, Henry Jackson, Kuechel, Javits, Humphrey, Dick Russell, these giants who were there at the time. And yet, when I saw them on the floor, these are human beings. They're human beings. They're talking, they're joking, they have their likes and dislikes, they have their strengths and their weaknesses. And I suddenly realized that, it's amazing that this is a human process in our democracy. I'll never forget, I'll just tell you one story. Russell Long, who was a senator from Louisiana, related to the Long family in Louisiana, they were calling they were doing a roll call. And they called Long's name. And Long had been drinking. He had a drinking problem. And he was so drunk he couldn't respond to the roll call. And George Murphy, who was the other senator from California, actually answered for him when they called his name. And I suddenly said, you know, this place is like the Rotary Club. It really is a human process. And I think just kind of understanding that human element and the importance of relationships. And by the way, that's the key to democracy, is the ability to have relationships with others. And understanding that and seeing that take place was very enlightening to me in terms of really kind of getting a sense of what kind of chemistry is involved in the legislative process.
Well, Speaker Brown had spoken earlier about staff and the electeds. And we've heard that some people say staff is helpful in building policy. Electeds have a lot of responsibilities, and yet you went from staff to an elected. And so what informed that decision to move into that place of leadership for civics?
Well, you know, I had spent time as a legislative assistant. And actually, when I went back there, I thought I would stay for 2 years and then come back to Monterey to practice law. Kuechel was defeated by Max Rafferty at the time, if you recall that. There are few people that remember that election. It was probably one of the first times that kind of the right wing came out on the Republican side, because Kuechel, as a Republican, had not really tended to his fences back in California, and Rafferty took advantage of that. Rafferty beat him. And at the time, you know, the decision I had to make is, do I come back to Monterey or stay here? And Ed Brooke, who was another member of the Senate, offered me a job. And then Jack Veneman, who some of you will remember, Republican in the state legislature. And Jack had worked very closely with Kuechel. Jack Veneman was asked to go back to Washington to be a deputy secretary at HEW, Health, Education, and Welfare, under Bob Finch, who became secretary of HEW. And Jack asked me if I would come down and be an assistant to the secretary to kind of, you know, talk to him, having worked in Congress, you know, talk about the issues and about how you deal with the Congress. And so I did. And almost immediately, civil rights became a huge issue. And I had worked on civil rights legislation with Kuechel and was very committed to it. And so I was soon appointed director of the Office for Civil Rights. And it was a tough job because Nixon had made a deal with the South on enforcing civil rights laws. And I kind of made the decision I was going to do that, and lost my job, eventually got fired. And John Lindsay, who had worked with Kuechel, asked me to come up to New York City and be an assistant to the mayor. So I did that and spent about 2 years in New York City, and then decided it was time to come back home. And when I came back home, I practiced law for a few years. But then, you know, once you've been in Washington, once you've kind of engaged in the process, it kind of gets to you, gets in your blood. And I decided at that point that I really did want to get into elective office, and then decided to run for Congress.
I don't want to be indelicate, but I heard that, was this true that part of the reason you were let go from your director of civil rights is because you wanted to move too fast? You wanted to implement change too quickly for the administrations that were risk-averse and cautious. Is that true?
Well, you know, look, director of the Office for Civil Rights at HEW was primarily responsible for enforcing Brown versus the Board of Education in the schools, and at that time it was targeting the South, because the South had by law separated black kids from white kids. So we had about 24 southern and border states that we were dealing with. And what had happened is Brown versus the Board of Education was decided, of course, by the court. But even after Brown versus the Board of Education, very little progress was being made. Justice Department was bringing additional suits based on Brown, but it was really tough to get districts to move. Then what happened is Lyndon Johnson passed the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which provided tremendous amount of funds for local school districts. And tied to that was a requirement that if you discriminate, your funds can be cut off, which produced the Office for Civil Rights to enforce that provision. So that was my job, was to go into school districts in the South to try to develop plans for desegregating those school districts. And with the threat that if they did not respond, we would move administratively to cut off their funds. And so that was my job. I was committed, obviously, to implementing that job. I'd sworn an oath to enforce the law. And I felt very strongly about that. At the same time, I was operating in the Nixon administration, which had cut a deal with the South, the so-called Southern Strategy. And Nixon was running against Rockefeller. And in order to consolidate his position in the Republican convention, basically cut a deal with Strom Thurmond and the South to support him on the promise that he would back off of strong civil rights enforcement. And so after the election, there were those around Nixon, obviously in the White House, who felt they had to deliver on that promise. And so from the very beginning, I mean, I thought Bob Finch was committed to strong civil rights enforcement. I wouldn't have become director if he wasn't. Jack Veneman clearly was. And there were others who were committed to that. So I always thought that Nixon, frankly, had been pretty good on civil rights himself as a Quaker. And what happened was, it wasn't long that I suddenly started getting a lot of political pressure from the South to slow down. And I tried to, you try to compromise, you try to understand, but what their concerns are, but you still have to do the job. And I think it was, I remember sitting down with Ehrlichman, who kind of, sent the message. He said, look, you gotta slow down. And I went home and I sat down with my wife, Sylvia. And I said, they really are pressuring me to back off here. And I've got a fundamental decision to make. Whether I continue to try to push on the law and try to do what I think is right, or whether I capitulate to these guys. I'll probably advance my career if I do that. I've got a decision to make. And Sylvia said, you got to do what's right. And I made the decision I was going to continue to do that and to continue to enforce the law as I saw it. So then what happens, to get a little insight into Washington, I get up one morning and I read in the Washington Post that Panetta has resigned. This is a true story. And they got a whole article on Panetta having resigned because of differences on civil rights. And I went downtown and went to Finch's office, and I said, Bob, I said, there's a story, that I've resigned. I haven't resigned. And he said, no, you're right. He says, just deny it. It's just, obviously it's the White House trying to play games with us. So I did. I went back to my office, and we continued to do work. Only they had the presidential press briefing that day at the White House, like they have now. And Ron Ziegler, who was the press secretary, was asked the question, what about this story that Panetta's resigned? And Ziegler said, yeah, that's true. So I saw that, and I said to Finch, I said, let me do a resignation letter and make it easy for you. So I did. Yeah. So I did. I resigned. Most people kind of figured out what had happened, but it was, for those who been in politics. It's one of those tough decisions you have to make. I tell the students at the Panetta Institute, let me tell you something. There will come a time when you will have to make a decision about what's right and what's wrong. And that decision could very well impact on your career. But in the end, you really do have to do what you believe is right. I strongly believe that it's important for people in politics ultimately to do what they think is right. And I've never regretted that decision. I mean, it was tough. You know, you have a family, I had 3 kids, but fortunately, Lindsay came and gave me the job in New York.
Well, I want to say that you alluded to 50 years of basically doing the right thing, working under multiple presidents of different parties, and also having tough jobs where you were required to make the tough call. You were paid not a great deal of money, but to make the hard call and to make it under the scrutiny of the public and the media and all the opinion makers. And so you went to the House and you became an expert, I understand, in budget. And I want to know why budget and what you thought that would bring you later on by being an expert in budget.
Look, let me tell you something about the Congress. In the Congress, and I think it's true in the legislature, knowledge is power. Okay? Knowledge is power. Most members don't know what the hell the budget is all about. Most members don't pay attention to the budget. But the budget sets priorities and sets spending limits and basically really does reflect what your values are. And when I was a legislative assistant and I worked with Kuechel, he was on the Appropriations Committee. So I learned about the importance of, numbers and the ability to be able to determine, priorities. And that's what it's about. So at the time that I got elected, the Budget Act had just been passed about 2 years before. The reason, it's interesting in our, over 200 years of history, there was no Budget Act for the Congress. There were appropriations, and appropriators basically determined how much was going to be spent and how much the deficit would be. But they did it through the spending process on appropriations. So what happened was that Richard Nixon decided to use his impoundment authority in order to basically stop congressional spending on pork. And Nixon did that, and people like Bobby Byrd and others on the Senate side said, this is crazy. We can't have the President of the United States challenging our power of the purse. But they also knew they couldn't just stop the impoundment authority because the politics in the country said, Congress are big spenders, they're not doing what's right on budget. So that's how they developed a budget process. And the Budget Act is actually called the Budget and Anti-Impoundment Act. And they established a budget process with budget committees on the House and the Senate side to enact a full budget, establish areas, how much we're going to spend on defense, how much we're going to spend on education and all of the other key areas. And then that would be a guideline for spending in the Congress, but through a budget resolution. So when I went back as a member of Congress, I got very interested in the budget issues and became a member of the Budget Committee. And I looked at the Budget Act, I studied the Budget Act, I understood how it operated in the time frame, and developed a lot of knowledge on the budget. And the result was that members started to come up to me and ask me, what's going on? What's the budget doing? Because most members did not follow the intricacies of the budget. And so that gave me, frankly, a power base from which to operate. And then I became chairman of the Budget Committee. And in that capacity, then engaged in negotiations for budget agreements that ultimately helped produce a balanced budget. But it was all because I developed that knowledge. I mean, look, as lawyers, you know when you walk into a courtroom, you better damn well know what the law is. You better damn well know what the facts are. You better damn well know what witnesses are going to say or not say. I mean, you develop knowledge. Knowledge is power in the courtroom. And it's the same thing in Congress or in the legislature. Knowledge is power. And that was the reason I selected the Budget Committee.
Well, that seemed like a stroke of genius, frankly, to find out budget, know how it works, get on the committee that chairs the budget priorities, become the chair, and then later on have people come to you to seek your advice, because it sets you up, of course, for friendships, relationships, which you talked about being the whole flow of democracy and power. So as you had this skill, were you surprised then to be tapped as chief of staff?
You know, the
How did that come about?
The first thing that happened was Clinton. The way it worked is I was chairman of the Budget Committee, and I'd been working with members. And Tom Foley, Dick Gephardt, George Mitchell went to Bill Clinton and said, we'd really like Panetta to become director of OMB. They knew that, director of OMB establishes budget priorities for the administration, works with the president on budget issues. And so they recommended me, and they told me that, and I had just been reelected to a new term in the House, and I wasn't quite sure whether I really wanted to do that. And then Bill Clinton called and said, "Come down to Little Rock. I want to talk to you about it." And I did. I went down. That was the first time I really spent a lot of time with Clinton, and it was about two and a half hours. Because those of you who know Clinton, he's got a mind like a steel trap. He doesn't stop, wanting information about the budget, the elements of the budget, how to pass a budget, all of the things we talked about. And we had a great conversation. And ultimately, as you know, he appointed me as director of OMB. And we did. We worked on the budget. We got his budget passed, which was, $500 billion in deficit reduction, by the way. $250 billion in savings on entitlements and discretionary, largely entitlements, and $250 billion in revenues. By the way, it's the same formula that Bush, I negotiated the Bush budget. We spent 2 months at Andrews Air Force Base, Republicans and Democrats trying to negotiate. We did, came up with a budget agreement, $500 billion, $250 in savings, $250 in revenues. And by the way, as a result of passing those two budgets, that's how we got a balanced budget. And that's how we ultimately got a surplus. And so we passed the Clinton budget. It was tough. Passed it by one vote in the House, or one vote in the Senate, the vice president's vote in the Senate. But we got it passed, and I was working on appropriations bills, and I was doing budget stuff. And Al Gore, who was a classmate of mine in Congress, came up and said, the president's thinking of appointing you as chief of staff. And I said, Al, I don't want to do that. OMB is across the street from the West Wing. The White House was a little screwed up, very frankly. They had staff people running all over the place. Their meetings were horrendous. And I just thought, that's the last place. If I go to the White House, people will be putting knives in my back. And so I said to Gore, I said, I really don't think I want to do that. Next thing I knew, the president said he wanted to meet with me up at Camp David. So I go with Gore up to Camp David, and I walk into the president's cabin in Camp David. And I walk into a room, and it's the president, it's Hillary, it's Al Gore, and Tipper. And at that point, I said, I'm in deep shit here. So, they went through it, and the president said, I really want you to become OMB director. And I said, Mr. President, I think I'm much more valuable to you at OMB. I really do. I'm trying to be honest here. I said, I really do. I know the budget. it's important to you. It's one of your legacies on the budget. I think I'm more valuable there. And I'll never forget, Bill Clinton leaned over and he said, you can be the greatest OMB director in the history of the country. But if the White House is falling apart, nobody will remember you. Those were his words. And so I said, ultimately I said, okay, I'll do this. And, I said some conditions, but so then I go to the White House. We've agreed I'm going to do this. He wants to announce this like the next day. And I thought, Jesus Christ, I've got to at least talk to poor Mac McClarty, who's in the job. And so I went to Mac and I said, Mac, you know what's going on. He said, yeah. He says, I said, I'd like to have an organization chart for the White House. And he said, I don't believe we have one of those. And I said, oh, man. So I became chief of staff. I frankly, my Army experience was a hell of a lot more important than anything else I'd done because I basically established a chain of command. I had to establish boxes. Who's in these boxes? Who's chief of staff? Who are the deputy chiefs of staff? Who do they respond to? Who do the members of the White House staff respond to? And I had to create a discipline within the White House so that everybody knew who they responded to. Because one of the problems was that everybody would go to the Oval Office for meetings. You'd walk in the Oval Office, there'd be 30 people there. And everybody'd be bullshitting, and nothing would get done. And so what I did, and I followed kind of the Jim Baker model on chief of staff, I basically said, everybody's got to go through me. Nothing's going to happen without people talking to me. Even the national security advisor. I said, you want to go see the president, you got to talk to me. And so I established the discipline with the president, established discipline within the White House on the staffs, got rid of some people who were not doing their job. And, people ask me what's the most challenging job I've had. Probably being chief of staff to Bill Clinton is one of the toughest jobs I've had because he spends life about 40 feet off the ground. And, he's got a great mind. He's very capable. I've never seen a mind operate the way Bill Clinton's does. He knows politics. He knows how to evaluate issues. He's just, he's got some tremendous qualities, but he is totally undisciplined. Totally undisciplined, as we've all found out. And I had to spend time dragging him. We go to a reception, and he would talk, but he loved engaging with people, and it was a challenge to drag him out of those meetings, and to keep moving. So it was tough. I had to really be a son of a bitch. But by the way, one of the keys is that I learned, and I had learned this before, but I really learned it in the White House, which is you have to speak truth to power. You got to tell them what you honestly think, and you have to tell them when he's screwing up. And thank God Bill Clinton was somebody who could take that kind of commentary because I had to spend a lot of time basically trying to keep both him and the White House on track.
Well, it's interesting since you say that was the most challenging job because, of course, we all know you were director of the CIA, and some of us would fathom that was pretty difficult. And then you didn't shy away from being Secretary of Defense and fighting al-Qaeda in many countries and taking out Osama bin Laden. And so of all of the jobs you've had, what was the most rewarding job and why?
Well, there's no question. Look, I like being in Congress at the time I was in the Congress because I was independent. I responded to the people in my district. They voted me, and it was at a time when you could get things done. It was a great time. I've seen Washington at its best, and I've seen Washington at its worst. No question, Washington is at its worst today. But at the time that I was there, you could really get things done. And you get things done for your district, and you get things accomplished. So I enjoyed being a member of Congress at that time. I would not enjoy being a member of Congress today. You'd probably find me in the Potomac. Although my son is running for my old seat, and he knows that he's got some real work to do to try to get it on the right track. But having said all of that, there is no question that having been CIA director and headed up the operation to go after bin Laden was something I will remember forever in terms of the different capabilities that were brought to bear and the nature of that operation. I mean, every clue about bin Laden had led nowhere. We didn't know where he was. Some said he was in a cave, some said he was in Pakistan, some said he was in Iran, some said he was dead. Nobody really knew. We finally, having established a task force to focus on this, they looked at the couriers. And as a result of identifying who the couriers were, tied a face to those couriers, we were able to identify who those couriers were. We located the couriers in a town called Peshawar in Pakistan. And through surveillance, we tracked them from Peshawar to the compound in Abbottabad. And when we saw the compound, when we followed their little SUV, and when it came to the compound, we looked at that compound and knew when we first looked at it, something was going on. This was a compound that was about 3 times bigger than other compounds, 18-foot walls on one side, 12-foot walls on another side. They had an 8-foot wall on the 3rd floor of the place, so you couldn't even see into the 3rd floor. And the people there, when they made a phone call, would go 90 miles away to make a phone call. So we knew it was high security. We knew something was going on, but we didn't know whether it was, some sheik who was trying to run away from his wives or what the hell it was. So we kept doing surveillance to try to identify whether bin Laden was there. We had looked at the clothes on the clothesline, identified the number of family members that matched bin Laden's family. But we could not get a firm ID on bin Laden. One quick story. There was somebody we noticed who would come out of the compound, go into the yard, and walk in circles like a prisoner in a prison yard. And he would go back in after doing about 20 rounds around the circle. And I said to the CIA guys, I said, for God's sakes, could be bin Laden. Put a telescope on a mountain, put some cameras on the wall. We need to see if this is bin Laden. And they said, it's really tough to do, Mr. Director. We got, these walls, 18-foot walls, 12-foot walls. We really can't get a good shot. I said, I've seen movies where the CIA can do this. And I had. But they couldn't get an ID on it. So we continued to collect intelligence. Had a pretty good idea that bin Laden might be there. We ran a lot of scenarios. And finally, the president said, I think we've got to do the operation to go after him because we're worried that this information may leak. So I sat down with Bill McRaven, Special Forces. We looked at several options. One was a B-2 bomber to blow the hell out of the place, which had a certain attraction. But that would level some other villages nearby. We looked at a drone strike, but that was kind of unpredictable. And so that's when we decided on the commando raid with the SEALs. And so we did it. 2 helicopters, 2 teams going 150 miles into Pakistan. Very risky. I mean, in the National Security Council, we went around the room. And I have to tell you, a majority of the people around that table thought that the operation was too risky. And I don't question it because it was risky. We didn't have firm information that it was bin Laden. And the president asked me, and I said, Mr. President, I have an old formula I used when I was in Congress, which is when I faced a tough decision, pretend I'm asking the average citizen of my district, if you knew what I knew, how would you vote? And I said, if the average citizen knew we had the best information on bin Laden, the location of bin Laden since Tora Bora, I think the average citizen would say, you got to go. And that's what I'm saying to you. I think you got to go. And to the president's credit, he made the decision next morning. The helicopters went in. One of the helicopters, because it was hot that day, stalled. And if you saw the picture in the White House, the look of fear on their faces was because it had, that was at that point. Helicopter went down. I remember calling McCraven. He was in Afghanistan. I was at the CIA. I said, what the hell's going on? And he didn't miss a beat. He said, no problem. We've got a backup helicopter coming in, a Chinook helicopter. We're going to continue with the operation. They did. They obviously accomplished that mission, and I thought they sent a very important signal to the world that nobody attacks this country and gets away with it.
That puts me in mind of the title of your latest book, Worthy Fights. So true what you have said in your career, your worthy fights. Principle, truth to power, educated risk as much as you can. And given all of this and the years of experience you have, why the Panetta Institute? Well, what is the Panetta Institute and why is the Panetta Institute?
My wife and I came back, when I left as chief of staff to Clinton, we came back to the district. And I had helped establish CSU Monterey Bay because Fort Ord had been bracked or closed. And so we were able to establish a campus of the CSU system there. And the chancellor at the time, Barry Muniz, asked us to get involved. We would have offices at the campus, which was nice. He wanted me to do a lecture series and some other things. And I began to do some classwork both at Santa Clara as well as at CSU. And I began to talk to students, and I was really worried that students were not interested in public service. At that point they were, looking at obviously business opportunities and other things, but they did not view public service as a higher calling. And I was really worried about that because I did. And I thought our democracy, cannot survive unless we get young people to be interested in getting involved. And so Sylvia and I decided that we would establish an institute with our primary mission being to inspire young people to get involved in public life. And we have developed a number of programs. One is an internship program where we train interns for 2 weeks, send them back to the California delegation, both Republicans and Democrats. They're there for about 4 months. We pay for everything because we want to open it up to everybody to have that opportunity. And my view is if we can expose them to Washington, that it create an interest in getting involved. We do a leadership program. We do programs to try to use young people to teach kids how to read in a Monterey County Reads program. We do a lecture series. And in the lecture series, what I do is I bring usually a Republican and a Democrat together to talk about issues so that we can have a civil discourse on issues and people can be exposed to all viewpoints, which is kind of the way I was trained in the Congress, and I think we need to get back to that. Anyway, we do that with our lecture series. So we now have young people that are working on Capitol Hill. They're running for city councils. They're working in Sacramento. And I think we're basically trying to plant seeds for the future.
That's fantastic. And in our own way, we're trying to do that here as well. So this is my last question. We're going to ask you to expound on it. But I've heard you say that this is a pivotal time in America. We either face the great American Renaissance or we face American dysfunction. So I want you to expand on that and tell us how can we experience the American Renaissance and what can all of us do to participate to ensure the American Renaissance?
Yeah, well, I think all of you, I'm sure, share my concern about the campaign we've just experienced, but more importantly, the reasons that produced a Donald Trump running for president. And I think a lot of it is the dysfunction in Washington. As I said, I've seen Washington at its best, and I think there's no question in my mind that Washington is the worst I've ever seen it in 50 years. They're divided. It's partisan. They aren't willing to sit down and negotiate and work together to resolve issues. And I think to a large extent, look, there's a lot of blame to go around for everybody. But the problem is that they've kind of given up. They've given up. And so issues like immigration reform, or issues like the budget, for God's sakes, we've got a $20 trillion debt. They can't cut a deal on the budget. They won't even get in a room to work together on a possible budget. People ask me what the biggest threat on defense. Biggest threat for defense in this country is an uncertain budget, not knowing what the hell we're going to get. And so they're not dealing with that. They're not dealing with funding infrastructure, for God's sakes. Everybody has said infrastructure is crumbling in this country. But they can't agree on how to put together a funding mechanism for infrastructure. Give me a break. The Zika virus, for God's sakes. The Zika virus is breaking out. And these guys aren't providing money to deal with the Zika virus? I mean, if I was in the Congress in my day and we refused to do that, I'd go home and get kicked out of office. And they're not doing war authority for the president at a time when we're fighting ISIS. And they're not approving a Supreme Court vacancy, for God's sakes. So issues that they've got to deal with in our society are not being dealt with. There's this great quote from Teddy Roosevelt who said, when faced with a tough decision, the best thing you can do is to make the right decision. The next best thing you can do is to make the wrong decision. But the worst thing you can do is to do nothing. And too often they wind up doing nothing. And my concern is that, we've gone through a number of years of paralysis now and gridlock. And the one thing we can't do is have another 4 years of paralysis in this country. Because I think it then will feed in to a nation in decline. I mean, we've seen how empires gradually fail throughout history. We know how they failed. And they failed because leadership did not step forward and take the risks associated with leadership to make the decisions you have to make. Look, governing's not easy. I know that. Governing's not easy. I mean, you got 535 members of Congress. Some are smart, some are dumb, some are honest, some are dishonest, some are stupid, some are jerks. I mean, the quotient of jerks is a little higher than I've ever seen it. But you have to deal with people. It's the nature of our democracy. You have to deal with people. And so you've got to engage, and you've got to be able to try to find compromise, find consensus, do what's necessary to be able to move solutions forward. We've got to get back to governing. That's key to our democracy. We have another 4 years of gridlock. Let me tell you something. You're already getting it with Trump. But in 4 years, you're going to get somebody who says, Congress can't work, the country can't work, I'm the only person that can get something done. And there's an appeal to that when nothing's getting done. So I think we're at a dangerous period. And it really is important to get back to the basic process that's involved here. And I think if Hillary Clinton's elected, and I think she will be, her major challenge is going to be to try to break the gridlock in Washington. I mean, I think there's two challenges facing a president. One is to break the gridlock in Washington. The other is to be a world leader in a very dangerous world. This is
This is a time when there are a hell of a lot of flashpoints in the world that have to be dealt with. So it's those two things. But being able to govern, being able to establish those relationships, being able to find those compromises, being able to reestablish trust. The only way we got things done in my day is because there was trust. You could sit in a room with Republicans who you trusted, not to put a knife in your back. And because of that, you were able to negotiate and to try to find answers. We need to reestablish that sense of trust between the president, between both parties in the Congress. I think, if she were to ask my recommendation, I would say, look, the most important thing you could do is try to move some legislation. Try to get something done. I think infrastructure is maybe one of those areas because there's a lot of bipartisan consensus on that. I think you might be able to work out a formula for funding it. I think you could do immigration reform. It passed the Senate. I think you could get it, try to move something on the House side as well. But if you could just get some things done, I think that would be really important to sending a message to the country that Washington can work and it can get things done. In my day, governing was good politics. It really was. If you could get things done, I went back to my district. They didn't always agree with my votes, but we got things done. And it was good politics. I don't think they think that governing is good politics right now. I think that's the biggest problem. They think that confrontation and beating the other side is good politics. And that's got to change. And the only way it changes is if you get some things done and show that the place can work. That's going to be the biggest challenge for the next president of the United States.
In February 2016, Leon Panetta spoke at the Conference of Chief Justices. After he finished speaking, 49 chiefs came up to me and said, "Why isn't he running?" Thank you, Mr. Panetta.